So one of the initiatives is one that will be based at my research center at Harvard. It's located within the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. The other initiative was developed by George Tumazzi, who was a resident fellow at our center 3 years ago. And in fact, it was George who inspired us to create our Africa Media Program. And we've gone through the formal process of Harvard of getting approval for the program, which is required for any program that is meant to be large and ambitious. And we've enlisted as a co-partner in that program, Harvard's Africa Studies Center. And our expertise at my center is in media, whereas the Africa Studies Center focuses on Africa and has an extensive network of Africa scholars and leaders to support its mission. Some of you know Emmanuel Ake-Ampong, who heads that particular program. And Emmanuel would like to be part of the speakers program today, but he's actually kind of trying to monitor 2 Zooms at once and is a principal in the other. So he's kind of a silent observer, and he's one of the people I'm going to provide the recording to after the session. So now we intend our program to act more or less as a think tank to assist in the development of public interest media in Africa. And we're going to be working in areas where the center has traditionally had expertise in staffing. We have deep experience in thinking through problems. Developing regulatory models is an example, proposing pathways to digital transformation, reimagining, strengthening journalism education, strengthening the practice, ordinary day-to-day practice of journalism, and organizing conferences and working groups as a means of informing media and public leaders about the nature of and need for public interest media in Africa. And our program will target 3 areas of need. One is journalism, which perhaps is the least important of the 3. We'll also be focusing on media infrastructure, the need for a substantial and economically viable media system that can really support quality public interest media, and then the legal and policy infrastructure within which media operate and which are essential to support public interest media. Now, we see this, as I said, as an ambitious program and a long-lasting one. We don't have a 5-year timeline or a 10-year timeline. It's an open-ended commitment on the part of our research center. And we don't plan to go it alone. We will, and we've already started to reach out to African media companies, governments, universities. We need help. And we're looking to important players in sub-Saharan Africa to provide much of the help that will inform what we do and put into place our efforts. And I think also there's the possibility of a broader mission. I think I'm getting ahead of myself as to what and how quickly we can do some of these things. But we'd like at some point to create an Africa Leaders Program at the Harvard Kennedy School. We have a Women's World Leadership Program at the Kennedy School that's been very successful in bringing together prominent women in leadership positions around the world to help them create networks and to think through the problems that they face and that their countries face. And we'd like to do much the same thing, a high-profile program that would involve a speakers series with prominent African leaders. And I also wouldn't rule out, it's difficult under Harvard rules, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that our center could play a role in helping to create a global media fund, similar to the Global Health Fund that Microsoft's Bill Gates and Columbia University's Jeff Sachs did some years ago. But our immediate need in our program is for funding. We need to bring on board as a first act a director of the program, someone who understands media, and also understands Africa. My specialty is media. I know sparsely little about Africa, and we need someone to lead this program who combines those two areas of expertise. And once that person is on board, that individual will be responsible for staffing out the program, launching these initiatives. As I indicated at the beginning, the areas that we'll be working in are areas where we already have staff and faculty. And so they can lend strong support to the staff that we'll put in place around the African Media Program. But we need a dedicated staff who's knowledgeable about Africa and media, and that's not me. So there's a point at which I'll be stepping aside. I'll be part of the program because I'm part of the center, and I'll be meeting regularly with the people who will be running the program. But we envision this as a pretty much standalone independent program within the center, like our other programs. And for that, we need the right staff. So let me turn now to George Tomasi. I indicated that George is a former Shorenstein Center Fellow, and many of the ideas that you're going to hear today came as a result of George's presence at our center. He's also the CEO of ABN Holdings, and he's going to describe for you the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative, which was the other initiative that I described briefly in the invitation letter. George?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Excellencies, and thank you, everybody, for coming through. And I'd like to particularly also thank the Honorable Kojo Oppong-Nkrumah for all his continuing support. The vision of the African Public Interest Media Initiative ensued out of a deliberative process which started in 2004, ironically, at the Kennedy School of Government. And the authors of the thoughts process that's led to where we are, it's not just myself, it's also Emmanuel Achampong, who's the head of the Center for African Studies at Harvard. So basically, through experiential knowledge, what has ensued is that Africa's public interest media systems are at a tipping point. Its foundations were stemmed in the immediate post-colonial transformation that occurred across the continent, which was stemmed as well in perhaps excitable political euphoria. We are in 2021, the digital world is upon us. Africa has not evolved completely into a digital ecosystem, and everything is moving to a super app. So the context here is as follows. The vision is to tap Africa's creative power to establish a viable public interest-oriented digital ecosystem, which will inspire our social, cultural, political, and economic emancipation. Within the context of myth, every powerful nation or groups of people or society, based on history recordal, has proven that the greatest civilizations on earth have flourished because of an unshakable confidence in the creative power of their myth systems and their belief systems. The sociological evaluations have indicated by and large that our systems of thought processing is tipping towards magical religious concepts. That is not true. What has ensued is that our systems of thought and engagement in terms of documentation has not in this modern era been widely disseminated. Therefore, our sociocultural and sociological evolution has perhaps tipped far more to the colonial period and has continued or mutated. For that reason, the mission of the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative is to create, for want of a better equivalent, an African Al Jazeera. This will comprise a lucrative or will be underpinned by what would become or translate into a lucrative Africa-centric entertainment-based digital ecosystem comprising African-inspired content channels, online education portals, Afrocentric animation-based video games, and a virtual assistance information technology-driven monetization ecosystem. In other words, there is enough capital knowledge capital, there's enough willpower politically to master financial capital to create an industry worth billions of dollars, which can support an editorially independent public interest system or public sphere of engagement to strengthen democracy and humanity-based governance on the continent. The implementation will have two parallel tracks. One is to establish a robust, editorially independent continent-wide public interest news and a current affairs system that will drive lasting change on the continent. The second is to establish an entertainment-based digital content publishing ecosystem made by Africans for Africans and drawing on our deep and rich cultural wealth, preserved for centuries through our uplifting oral traditions, to recreate authentic and inspiring narratives for a future of infinite possibilities in which the noteworthy achievements of our forebears born out of the power of their legend and myth will become the norm. There's a huge opportunity financially, which has been documented by a very recent publication by Google and IFC, that by 2025, the telcos primarily will begin to yield revenues, high yield revenues, upwards of 180 billion US dollars. But for media and for entertainment to tap into that, there has to be thought leadership. There has to be a rethink of how public interest media is configured on the continent. Currently, we have friends on this call who have been extraordinarily helpful to help establish this process. James Dean, in particular, who from the very onset, we met in November, we met in 2003, but in recent times, in November 2018, when I was at the Shorenstein Center, and he did invite me thereafter to a meeting in February 2019, where I met Nishan Lalwani, and the rest is history. So to round off, the intent is to change the paradigm of the way we engage with the world, the way we tell our stories, and in doing so, create a profitable and lasting proposition. Thank you.
George, thank you very much. We're honored to have with us His Excellency John Kufuor, the former president of Ghana. Mr. President, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I was privileged to be the chair of the ECOWAS, the Economic Commission of West African States, twice. I think 2002, 2003, and then 2007, 2008 January, I was chair of the African Union. I was founding member of the current Union of Africa, or African Union, when it succeeded the Organization of African Unity. I was again a member of Heads of States that launched the Africa Peer Review Mechanism among presidents to foster good governance on the continent. And in fact, I was the first president to have been peer reviewed. I think it was in South Africa or so, 2003. What I found through my long sojourn in politics, and I started in from 68, 69, till I became president of my nation, 2001. After independence, I find that across the continent, and Africa is very big, of about 54, 55 countries, sovereign and independent countries. What I found was that even though all of us, the nations, have been espousing the need for union or unity, somehow over the past 60 years or so of independence after colonialism, it seems, in spite of the vision of a united continent in terms of politics, trade, culture, and so forth and so on, and are wanting to sort of define the continent to the rest of the world, it has been very difficult for the continent to succeed in this ambition. Why? Because unfortunately, various nations and leaders so far have tended to insist on their exclusive sovereignty within their national bounds. Even though we've been talking it's been very hard to give and take. Not only that, we also see that this aspiration of a prospering and advancing continent has been more at the leadership level and not at the grassroots level. Why? Because there's hardly the communication across the continent. And Africa is very big for this matter. I always say that you stop a man in the streets of, say, Accra in West Africa, and you want to find out what he knows of East Africa, say Kenya or Tanzania, or if you move down south, Central Africa, South Africa, or North Africa, I tell you, this person might not be able to tell you much. And it's the same in the other parts of Africa, meaning perhaps at the grassroots, Africa is yet to begin to know itself the way it should, so that it will come to share in value systems across the board among the humanity of Africa. And once it's able to do this, then the long period during which the continent has tended to be defined from outside itself, from Europe, from the Americas, or say Asia, would cease and allow Africa to tell the rest of the world that it's not just a continent of pigmentation, black people's continent, poor people's continent, continent full of diseases and illiteracy and so forth and so on, continent of disadvantage. No, Africa is so naturally endowed when you're talking of resources. And it's not just the raw material resources, even in humanity. We know in history that way back, perhaps it could be the cradle of many a civilization, but who has been here to tell the rest of the world, genuinely and not emotionally, of the potential of this continent? For the past 600 years or so, this continent has been held down from outside itself, through slave trade, through colonialism. And what we are finding now is that the continent has been afflicted with undermined self-confidence. Without confidence, without self-confidence, you don't get creative. The Organization of African Unity that was launched about 1963 or so tried its best, but it turned out to be an organization to fight for the liberation from colonialism of the continent and apartheid. Now we are into the African Union period from 2003. And even though we've been again talking of the necessity to cooperate so that our continent might hold its own in the global community, for trade, for politics, for education, culture, and so forth and so on, it's taking so long. And the movement, I believe, is still snail-paced. So when I met George, I think about 3 or 4 years ago in London, we'd gone for some occasion at the Claridge's Hotel, and he approached me and broached the subject of the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative. It tickled me because I had also been advocating for Africa to define itself to the rest of the world. I thought this was it, because you talk of the digital technologies as vehicle for Africa to discover itself across borders and use a media that is independent of the authorities of government and of the corporate world. Media of very professionally trained news people appreciating the vision of Africa coming into its own and or taking the mainstream of globalization. And so I thought this might be the way to accelerate the search by the continent to portray itself to the globe as a continent standing shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the continents of the world in moving humanity to the dignified ends of humanity. And I jumped into it with him, and he's been pushing me every now and then, and we've been working at it till now. And I'm so happy to be taking part in this colloquium with all of you, and the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And we hope there will be more participants, because I believe that I know that the African Union has got a commission with a communications department that has worked an agenda. The commission has worked an agenda termed or dubbed Agenda 2063, by which the continent will come by inclusive political and economic transformation to benefit the peoples of Africa. I love it, but the commission talks of an agenda that would be worked by plans of 10 years a time. But the way the world is settling on, the globe is settling on, 10 years might prove to be such a long time. And unless we have this initiative within a digital ecosystem, moving thing across, and not through government, but at grassroots, as well as even governments at all levels of society, Africa will continue to remain on the sidelines, which to me shouldn't be acceptable. So I'm supporting the effort for this initiative to establish a truly independent, objective, well-informed information systems working across borders at all levels of society from grassroots that would empower the African as an individual. If you are talking democratization, democracy definitely is not alien to Africa. I believe basically it's humanity, and that's what I'm supporting. So the people will be empowered to hold their leaders to account. And a leader who is not measuring up to the mandate given to so shouldn't have the luxury of changing constitutions if of the time when he should be stepping down as president to continue to impose. And this initiative, I believe, is the initiative that our continent should want, and it should work with, as I said, at all levels of the African society, even with the African Union itself. So truly, the African would be empowered through sense of responsibility in himself or herself, as well as through accountable governance. And with that, I believe Africa would negotiate fairly and equally with the rest of the continents and for humanity, for all of us to make headway. And this is why I'm supporting, and I'm hopefully inviting everybody, not just presidents or corporate world, but entire population, entire world. And I'm happy that Harvard Kennedy School is accepting to play a role, because it's a matter of knowledge and global awareness of mankind. They're accepting to be part of it. Of course, to deepen the self-confidence, the real home of Africa defining itself should be on the continent of Africa. So this is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're also honored to have with us His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. And Mr. President, thank you for setting the stage. I don't need to repeat what you have said, strategic things in the ambition to unite our continent, but we have binding constraints, which we couldn't do this throughout the struggle for unity and cohesion within the African continent. I have three issues to be very brief on my presentation. The first one is the initiative could play a key role, the African Public Interest Media Initiative, and we launched it. I share the vision of the president and also of George to work together with them in this regard. I think we could play a key role in the realization of the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which might also end up as a failure if there is no robust and vibrant media, a public media initiative that brings Africans together. I think this is one of the main issues. I think one of the African Union's flagship program, which I believe as a landmark decision that has been made by our heads of state and government. Of course, Ghana is hosting this initiative. And I think this brings 1.3 billion people and around 3.4 trillion US dollars of economy into integration. And we can trade with each other, but without knowing each other, how can we do the trading business? So I think none other than the African Public Interest Media Initiative can address this binding constraint. The second issue is the initiative will facilitate the effective imagining and the translation of the vision for African Renaissance. That has also been said, which many of our intellectuals, thinkers, and senior statesmen who have come before us have been, and they still are strong advocates for it. These include Edward Wilmot, to whom the ideology of Pan-Africanism is largely attributed, but we haven't sold these Pan-African ideals properly to our children. So we need to see what Pan-Africanism is and how to sell this ideology to our children. And I think we need, again, Sheikh Anna Diop, a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, and physicist, and also politician who studied the human race and origin and pre-colonial African culture, which has been forgotten. Africa is the cradle of mankind, but the pre-colonial African history, no one knows it. And we have the basis for our, economic emancipation and cultural and political, works in Africa. But this needs a public interest media initiative to work with. My close friend, former president of South Africa, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, was, he was a champion and he continues to be a champion for African Renaissance. What does that mean? We need to explain this to our people, to the citizens of Africa and to the global community. The third is perhaps the most important, an increasingly unpredictable era of misinformation and disinformation with regards to Africa. And I think there is a strong need to repurpose how Africa communicates with itself and with the global community. And this is also very important. This will require a well-thought, thorough approach as to what levels of strategic partnerships, and requires within and outside of Africa how a financially sustainable and editorially independent Africa public interest media ecosystem is funded. This is an important issue we have to address. And again, what is the core areas of focus? Should it be in terms of content creation? And the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative has the capacity to realize these three important issues I mentioned. And therefore, I think we require a visionary thought leadership and effective structural capital to achieve this. I believe this forum comprises like-minded personalities, Africans, and friends of Africa. And I wish to have a very good deliberation to come up with a solid outcome of these discussions. Thank you, Professor.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you. Next, I'd like to call upon the Honorable Kojo Bong Nkrumah, who's Ghana's Minister of Information. Minister.
Thank you very much, Professor, and good afternoon from the village of Ofuasi, where I'm a member of Parliament, and joining you to all of you, to former President Kufuor, to His Excellency, the former Prime Minister, and to you all. My comments are pretty brief. I was first introduced to this conversation by President Kufuor when he got me in touch with George, and we started examining the various concept notes and documentation that had been prepared for this enterprise. I happened to practice as a journalist for about 10 years before coming into politics and governance. And the principles that you espoused this afternoon of media having strong power to help people define themselves, additionally to stimulate aspirations of the people, whether north or south, to showcase opportunity and even to strengthen democracy. They are things that I identify with from my personal experience. I just want to make about 3 quick points. First, I know that on the state level or the continent-wide level, there's already a conversation going on between the current Ethiopian Prime Minister and the current President of Ghana on how to explore options of a strong media voice for the continent and to route same through the continental body. So I think the government or the state maneuvers are already beginning to take place exploring that. But on the, may I say, non-governmental or civil society level, I believe that the conference of persons in academia, private business, etc., who are here, constitute a good body to build a more permanent feature that will be advocating for this cause and pushing the elements together. And if there's any interest to establish a vehicle that can advocate and push consistently for this, I think that I have the permission of my president to say that we'll be more than happy to support that vehicle established and to kick off as soon as possible. And then finally, I think it was mentioned, we need to find ways by which we can stimulate complementary action from the private sector media players on the continent themselves. We have been operating, and I say we because I've been in the industry for a while, we've been operating as champions of little markets for a very long time. There's a need for, hopefully, if this civil society wing is harnessed, there's a need for this wing to shepherd the efforts of private sector players on the continent, from Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, West Central, Northern, to also birth that vehicle that hopefully can champion the cause of advancing the next frontiers of African media through digital innovation and through content that allows us to do all the lovely things that we've been talking about. So I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to be of service. Thank you.
Minister Nkrumah, thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Sheetal Vyas, who's the founding executive director of the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Please.
Thank you, Professor Patterson, and thank you everyone for inviting me here today to talk a little bit about our idea around the International Fund for Public Interest Media and the potential synergy with the African Public Interest Media Initiative. Really delighted to be part of the conversation. I would like to note that IFPIM is a distinct and also a very complementary initiative to the African Public Interest Media Initiative. We've been incredibly honoured in common with the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative to have received the invaluable backing of His Excellency John Kafur, who actually wrote the preface for our detailed feasibility study that was published last year for our fund, and we are very thankful for that support from the President. We've also been in very close contact with George Chimazi, and we've been really grateful for his advice that he's provided as we've been developing our idea, our proposition, and to have been engaged in some very useful conversations and discussions with His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn. So we're really thankful for all the support that's been provided to help us push forward the idea that we have. We indeed share the analysis of the initiative around the need for increased support and funding alongside the need for a more supportive infrastructure and legal framework so that media organizations can thrive, public interest media organizations can thrive on the continent. And others have so eloquently talked about the need for this. So I won't talk in detail about that, but what I would like to do is just for those of you who aren't familiar with what we're looking to achieve, provide you with a little bit of background about the idea behind the fund and the problems that we're trying to solve. And then also give you an update on where we are right now with this ambitious idea. So in terms of what we're looking to do, we really want to significantly increase the resources that are provided to independent media in low and middle income countries. And for us, we see there being a desperate need for that support in the African subcontinent, and would be an important geography for us to focus our resources on. And we're looking to increase that funding from multiple sources. We not only want to increase the amount of government donor budgets that are allocated towards independent media, and our aim there would be that we could increase that percentage up to 1%, which at the moment it's standing at around 0.3%. So we feel there's significant scope for governments across the world to support independent media globally. But we also want to increase the amount of funding that's provided from corporates, and within that specifically technology companies in particular, alongside those foundations that aren't providing support to the sector right now. And from those three sources that we've outlined, our belief is that if we can channel those funds through an independent mechanism, which has legitimacy in the countries within which we operate, we're not aligned to any single country or single corporate where they are trying where it gets difficult, I would say, to provide direct funding towards media organizations. But we're independently governed, an independent board that can help us make those decisions on which organizations we provide support to. Then we think actually a mechanism like that will provide the basis for that kind of exponential rise in the amount of funding that can be provided. And with that funding, what we want to do is provide or help support sustainable models for journalism, just as others have outlined, help these organizations transition through this period. You know, we've been calling it a media extinction event, such that they can come out of the other side with sustainable digital models whereby they can continue into the future. And we see that this fund needs to play a role. We think it's around a 10-year horizon where we can provide this financial support alongside, I was delighted to hear about the kind of enabling environment support that others are working on, such that we can provide the best opportunities for these organizations to survive over the medium and long term. Across all of this, we think that by creating an independent mechanism, we'll be able to reduce the amount of transaction costs that exists around providing support to media on the continent at the moment, and actually having an independent mechanism where that support can be channeled also provides a much more cohesive and coherent framework, such that we can learn the lessons of what works in supporting media, and we can share and disseminate those lessons across the market, not just across the African subcontinent, but but at a global level as well, so that we can improve and help sustain the entire sector across this period of time. In terms of where we are with this, James Dean, who's on the call from the BBC Media Action team, spent a lot of time working on our feasibility that I mentioned that His Excellency John Kufuor provided the preface for. That provided a wonderful basis and assessment of whether a fund like this was needed, and the kind of overwhelming response from all of the feedback that we did and all the stakeholder analysis that was undertaken at that time was yes, a fund like this is needed. But also it's helped us engage with others and build support for a fund of this nature. And so over the last 18 months or so, this fund has been guided by an advisory group. It has representation on that advisory group, not just from academics, but from journalists, and that's very much a global representation that we have. And we've been able to secure the support from other organizations in more recent months. So we secured the support from the United Nations Secretary General around the need of a fund like this in May. And he has been urging donors and foundations and also corporates to fund an initiative of this nature. We've been really delighted. We do feel that there is a moment right now, perhaps unlike any other time to date, whereby it hasn't been difficult for us to make the case around the need of supporting independent media. And in fact, the response that we get from many is that there's a global need for this, in addition to the need for support in low and middle income countries, which is our specific focus within IFPIM. And we've been really encouraged by the progress that we have been making. We've secured funding so far for our initial secretariat to try and make this happen. And as part of that, our job right now is to fundraise for the large amount of grant funds that we're looking to deploy. We're also in tandem with that fundraising effort, building out the design of the fund. This fund is not designed to be a hangover from the colonial past and to be centered in developed countries and imposing views on the continent. It's absolutely the opposite of that. We see ourselves having a very decentralized structure, a very regionalized structure with presence in the continents within which we will be dispersing funds and the beneficiary countries within which we want to operate. Alongside that, I see our leadership being decentralized as well, so that there's no kind of central power hub. We need to be as close as possible to the environments within which we're operating, and we really need to have a tailored country-specific approach under our regional structure, such that we can really work towards the specific requirements in the countries that we're working in to help improve and strengthen the media that exists. I think I'm gonna finish there. Maybe just finally, what I'd like to say is that our aspiration is that we'll be fundraising this year and early next year. But then subsequent to that, our aim is to launch this fund next year, should we be successful, and enter into a proof of concept stage where we will be piloting in a number of countries. And should we be successful in demonstrating the impact of this fund and how we can support media in this pathway to sustainability, then our aim is then to scale up significantly post that period. But yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today.
Sheetal, thank you so much. You mentioned James Dean, who's going to talk next, and I've had the pleasure of several discussions with James, and George earlier mentioned James's role in his own thinking. George and James have been working on this issue for a long time. I'm a relative newcomer to it, and I've been very dependent on the thinking of George and James. And so James, you're up. James is the policy director for the International Fund, and of course, his work with BBC Media Action. James.
Tom, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in such august company. Very good to see Your Excellency Kafur and Your Excellency Desalegn and Minister Nkrumah as well, and many others on this call, very good friends. Just to be clear, I'm actually a consultant to the International Fund, but this meeting I'm representing BBC Media Action. And although BBC Media Action is a separate entity and independent of the BBC World Service, I can also talk a little bit about some of the plans that have been discussed between the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative and the World Service. So BBC Media Action is a media support organization, and it particularly is interested and keen to support African-led initiatives of this kind. And as George has said, I've been talking to him and trying to provide any technical advice or technical support that we've been able to over the last 2 or 3 years. And we've also acted as a kind of liaison point with the World Service. And I just wanted to as a result of that, there's been various meetings with the World Service, and particularly with Jamie Angus, the former head of the World Service, and that agreed the following. I'll just read this out just to make it clear from early this year. And Jamie Angus said, having worked in Africa near to 100 years now, the BBC World Service would be delighted to coordinate input from its African services, from BBC Media Action and Rapid Blue Productions, which is the BBC Studios television production arm in Africa, into a plan which would help deliver the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative. To this effect, we propose a series of electronic roundtables to be facilitated by the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative. The BBC will make available appropriate staff and expertise to advise on to the future development of the initiative, identify mutually beneficial synergies where they can align with BBC's own plans and interests, and determine any potential follow-up subject to further BBC decision-making. These roundtables can be centered on the areas already identified as fruitful paths to the project, including engagement with the Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Research and Policy, and a focus on content production, distribution driven from within Africa. So that's in essence is about how the BBC World Service can provide thought leadership, if you like, or as many people are saying, or contributions of its own insight and advice to this. And what that will look like, and George and I have been talking about this for some time, is a series of seminars bringing together with George, but bringing together various sources of BBC expertise, if you like, on how to how do we confront these huge challenges of generating African-driven journalistic content, distributing, as His Excellency Kafur has so powerfully talked about, distributing African-driven journalistic content across the continent, but also entertainment content and distributing entertainment content, and also issues of building capacity as well. So I want to be very brief here because I know we've got another speaker, but it's taken a little while, to be honest, to get this going, because shortly after writing that letter, Jamie Angus left, and we wanted to be sure that, that there was good high-level backing of this within the BBC World Service. So we've been waiting for a new director to be appointed. That's taken a bit longer than people felt, but we're now, Arturo Wallace is my colleague who's on the call. Both of us are working together with colleagues in the BBC World Service to take these forward. We know that Lillian Landor, who's the new head of the World Service, director of the World Service, will be joining later this month. And she is being briefed on these discussions, and plans are in place to set up meetings with her to map the process going forward. So we're delighted to be engaged on this process. I should be clear that I'm wearing several hats, so I'm particularly my hat here is on the BBC Media Action As Sheetal says, I'm also heavily involved in having developed the International Fund for Public Interest Media as well. So I hope there's no confusion about all those different roles, and I'm delighted to be here.
James, thank you. Our final speaker is Nishat Lavani, who's the managing director at Luminate Foundation. It's good to be on Zoom again with you, Nishat, please.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and everyone for having us here today. And it's been fascinating to hear about the challenges and also the kind of promising solutions around supporting media in the African context. I'm head of programs and managing director at Luminate, which is a non-profit philanthropic foundation that supports democracy, media, and governance in about 20 countries in the world, including in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. I'm not an African, and I'm not bringing an African perspective to this, but we have been working on funding and supporting media for about 10 years now, and have seen many of the challenges facing media around the world. Some of those are common, but some of them are very much unique to Africa. I will say that some of our biggest success stories have come from within the African continent when it comes to media, and there are numerous high potential and successful media organizations that we've been very proud to be able to support in Africa. I'll highlight a few of them. I'm sure you know most of them already, but I do enjoy talking about their work. The first is Amabagane in South Africa, which did groundbreaking work that uncovered the corruption between the sort of Zuma-Gupta nexus that eventually brought down the Zuma government in South Africa. Amabagane, when we funded them, were a small spin-out from the Mail and Guardian in South Africa from their investigative unit. And the tremendous work that they did uncovering the illicit financial flows between Zuma and the Gupta family has set the tone for investigative journalism in sub-Saharan Africa. The second I'd like to highlight is STEERS in Nigeria, which you may know is a business-oriented investigative unit that did a fantastic job during the Nigerian election of covering critical data around political candidacy, voting, and other key election information, something which hadn't been done to that standard, to our knowledge, in Nigeria before their work. They're a for-profit institution, but working very much in the public interest as well as in the private one, and are growing their business in a way that will hopefully allow for a better quality of data around all Nigerian elections in the future. The South Africa Media Innovation Program in South Africa is an incubator, an accelerator for media organizations, for startups, and has been at the helm of incredible new startups across South Africa, and supporting existing ones such as the Daily Vox and others in their growth. They have an emphasis on digital media startups, which are of course the norm these days, and they provide not only financial support but also direct capacity building and a series of mentors to help young startups grow and ensure that we have innovation, not only in the newsroom, but also on the business side of media organizations. And the fourth, and one of the more interesting examples I'll cite is Africa No Filter, which is, it's not strictly a news organization, but it is a fellowship program for African storytellers. And the goal of Africa No Filter is to ensure that stories about Africa are told by Africans in Africa, and not by foreign media who often perpetuate oversimplified and also harmful stereotypes about what Africa is, focusing more on poverty and corruption than on many of the kind of promising stories of growth and success. And Africa No Filter was started by Luminate and Ford and a number of other foundations just a couple of years ago. So I wanted to highlight some of the incredibly promising organizations that have been started by African entrepreneurs in the media space. They're very different, those four examples, but they have one thing in common, and that is that they're all struggling to raise money. And they shouldn't be. They're extraordinary organizations led by extremely competent entrepreneurs. And yet they're struggling to raise money, and therefore they are struggling to grow. And that's a travesty, because really they're delivering public goods where they're most needed, and they're doing it in a way that's ethical and that's centered around the communities that they're hoping to serve. And the reason they're struggling to raise money is because there are very, very few funders for independent media on the African continent. And that's been a perennial issue. And unfortunately, it's getting worse as commercial models are put under pressure by the digital advertising economy of Facebook and Google. And the minuscule amounts that even successful advertisers get paid. And so really what we've seen at Luminate, and if you ask our colleagues at the Open Society Foundation or at the Wraith Foundation in South Africa, or any of the other handful, you can probably count them on one hand, the number of funders of African media, the independent funders anyway of African media. The one thing they will say is that it's our responsibility to change this and to make sure that we have a pluralistic, a robust media ecosystem in Africa, and that a necessary condition for doing that is to raise more money to support those initiatives. And that's necessary for the African Public Interest Media Initiative. It's necessary for the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And ultimately, it's necessary for the success of independent media in Africa. Thank you so much.
Nishant, thank you. I think if you've been listening to all these talks, you can see where a lot of things are starting to come together and in a complementary, sometimes supplementary way. And so I think this is really an opportune time to advance the effort that all of us have been talking about. We have about a half hour left, so we want to open it up for your ideas and for discussion. I think at this point, I'll turn the moderator's role over to George. To some degree, the Harvard program had its genesis in George's ideas, for which we're thankful. And clearly, George has been at the center of putting this group together. So, George, if you would take on the moderator's role, and if you have something you'd like to add to the conversation, please unmute yourself and join in, and we'll try to be as responsive as possible.
Thank you, Tom. So I think it would be very helpful, before we take in questions, to maybe hear from Steve Martin. Steve knows the continent very well, has been working with me for the past 17 years to get the BBC's buy-in. So I think Steve's perspective, before we basically take any question, would be very helpful. Steve.
George, you're very persuasive, which is one of your charms, and it's always a pleasure to work with you. Distinguished panelists and good friends, it's good to be here with you this afternoon. I'll be very quick because we've heard a lot already, and I know time is tight on these calls. I'll just make a couple of points from my observations as a BBC person who's worked in Africa, but clearly I don't bring a direct African perspective myself. The first is this. Public interest media is not the preserve of national broadcasters and state broadcasters. There's no incompatibility, if you like, between public service and a commercial model. And we see some of the best production, some of the best journalism on the African continent coming out of privately held media houses. And as the BBC, while we're creating content from a publicly funded organization, we're often working with privately held interests in order to amplify that journalism, in order to ensure the distribution is effective. So that's my first observation. And sometimes I find people react with surprise about that notion, but it's increasingly the case in my experience. And indeed, the very presence of advertising or sponsorship around public service content can, in many cases, help to underline its independence from vested interests. So I'd like to get that off my chest and get that on the table, because that, I think, is really important. And if we can all accept that, and I'd be interested to hear debate around that point, then I think that opens up additional channels for potential investment. And the second thing, listening to Nishant there, which really strongly resonates with me, is the point about African stories told in African voices. And although the BBC, as you know, is an international broadcaster, the biggest investment the BBC World Service has ever made in Africa has been in the last 3 years, where we've started to create 1,000 hours of new video content produced in Africa. We've invested in new production facilities and hired hundreds of staff from the local markets, particularly in Kenya, in Nairobi and Lagos, Nigeria, but also in our other bureau, places like Johannesburg and Dakar. And the result of that investment has been some remarkable new content, particularly on the hard-nosed journalistic end of things. The Africa Eye series of investigative documentaries, which has already won a number of international awards, is doing strong public interest journalism, but is also taking the power of African journalism around the world, thanks to the BBC's international distribution channels. And similarly, programs like Life Clinic, which take really critical issues about health and well-being through the eyes of people in Africa, telling those stories on a personal level, are generating content that has not been seen before, because it's sharing stories across different cultures within the African continent. And that's really one of the other roles that the BBC as an international broadcaster has been able to play. So, you know, we're very supportive of this. As you've heard from James Dean, we've got some practical plans in place already with our colleagues at BBC Media Action to facilitate some workshops. And all of this chimes very strongly with the BBC's own objectives in ensuring that everybody around the world has access to independent and trusted journalism. So it's a huge pleasure to be part of this scheme. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Steve. As you spoke, the one name that came to mind was Komla Dumor, and I hope that this really does take off for the work he started at the BBC. Thank you. There are 3 people I'd like to call on, but in the meantime, perhaps if you've got any questions, you can fill them. But 3 people I'd like to call on for very specific seminal reasons. Edward, my friend Edward Ifa, who has a private banker's perspective, but who I believe will make a significant contribution to this process in terms of its taking off. Professor Kwame Karikari, who's one of the most eminent public interest media advocates on the continent, and Tom Ragg, who represents the African Association of International Broadcasting. Tom works with Simon Spanswick, and Simon has been a friend and a mentor to me for more than 25 years. So I know that AIB will make a significant contribution to this. But before I call on these 3 minds, if there's any question that anyone would like to fill, I'll make notes so you can add to the flavor of this discussion. In the absence of any question, Edward, we'd be very grateful to hear from you, your view from the private sector, and what we need to do to make this happen. You're on mute. You got to unmute, yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, George, for the invitation and for being part of this group. I think there's no question from all the speakers that the Africa Public Interest Media Initiative is really needed by Africa. From the point of view of the private sector, it is very needed because we often have to sell in my case, Ghana to whether it's the city or to Wall Street. We've been part of the Eurobond shows, and quite often you're educating people about basics. So it'll certainly help promote investment. It'll help improve people's knowledge about Africa, and it'll help in improve trade flows all around. So I think there's no question that the initiative is really needed, and congratulations to all those who have helped to bring it to this stage. It was very surreal and insightful hearing from His Excellency President Kufuor on the challenges they've had in selling Africa to the rest of the world in various fora, and certainly this will help change some of those perceptions. I think where I would like to see the conversation move to is how we begin to create the organization which will drive the public interest media, Africa Public Interest Media Initiative. What will be the structure of the organization? What will be I'm a banker, so I like to see cash flows and the business models and all that. So we should probably begin to move the conversation from the vision and whether it's needed to what does it look like in very concrete steps, and the shape and all the rest of it. What is the roadmap to making sure we set up a very successful media organization which will be sustainable and which will be able to make a significant impact in achieving the goals of Africa Public Interest Media.
Thank you, Edward. On that point, I just want to mention this before I call on the next kind of comment. We have on this call two minds who have that competence to help shape this process. John Sanderson, who's my chairman at ABN Holdings Limited, and who worked in the City of London as a media analyst. He's very experienced, has detail in terms of understanding how macro funds are put together. So we have that competence in hand. We also have Robert Soterio, who is a genius at financial modeling, simple as that. But that conversation will happen separately from this platform, Edward. Okay. So we've got to make that happen as soon as you're back in Accra.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And also how it will coexist with existing private media houses, whether it's South Africa Broadcasting Corporation, Channels Nigeria, Joy Media in Ghana, and how they'll work together.
You're thinking about mergers and acquisition, knowing your mind, but we'll leave it at that.
Anyway, yeah, I think we can take it off, but that is where my mind is as to how we set it up and how we achieve it, because there's no question in everybody's mind that it's very needed and it's very necessary.
Thank you. So we'll move to Professor Karikari from the context. Prof, if you could talk about your experience and with specificity to how an African media program at Harvard, for example, your inputs, knowing that you sat on the board of the Africa Media Initiative, which we helped shape, but became a learning curve for all of us. If you've got comments, I think it would be very beneficial to Tom, Professor Patterson, your inputs. So what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much, George, for getting me into this very august forum to be among all of these eminent personalities. To begin with, let me say that I was quite happy and thrilled that somebody like President Kufuor is involved in this project. Why? Apart from his wisdom and other resources, we are talking about public interest media, and public interest media will thrive in an atmosphere of freedom. And President Kufuor has been one of the most credible fighters and promoters of press freedom, human rights, not only in Ghana, but on this continent. So if somebody like that is on this platform, in this project, I think that what we are doing will have the atmosphere or the environment to operate freely. Without an atmosphere of freedom, no public interest journalism can survive. Thank you very much. I don't think we need to belabor the validity of this project. President Kufuor and the Prime Minister Desalegn have really summed up what this should be about. And so we don't need to belabor them. And George, you yourself spoke earlier on about an African Al Jazeera, and then you also were focusing on entertainment. But let me just give one small example why what you want to do, even in the realm of entertainment, in the area of Africans creating and broadcasting, publishing knowledge about Africa to Africans is so critical. Take, for instance, the cell phone and the cartoons on the cell phone and the cartoons on television. There are no African characters for my toddlers to look at. There are no African cartoon stories on all of these platforms for my up-and-coming little children to look at. The image of Africans as African people, Black people, is not on the screens. So the project's validity, the importance of this project is not to be belabored at all. Now, again, to come back to AMI, the African Media Initiative. The African Media Initiative is also one of many such attempts at promoting what you are doing now. But what is the difference? And I think that is what makes the initiative you have taken so important and worth promoting and worth advocating for and supporting. One, AMI, as well as all of the other, and BBC has played quite a role in the initiation of some of all of these initiatives and so on the continent in the past 20, 25 or 30 years. But what your project, the difference that it makes is that you have not only developed the ideas, but you've gone forward to try and build institutional support, to try and build an international support system or eminent international advocates to push this forward. The documentation you have done, the plans for, I heard Mr. Ifa brilliantly also articulating some of the critical practical steps that need to be taken beyond this point. But I see that the documents that you gave me in conversations with you, these provide some guidelines, if not the full answers. You have already put in place mechanisms for answering all of these practical and bottom line questions that are needed to be answered and to move this whole project forward. The association with Harvard, for instance, brings at the least prestige of a certain character to the whole project. The International Public Interest Media Fund and all of the people associated with this, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia associated with this, brings the whole of the Horn and Eastern African political support behind him. So I think that what I see, the difference I see from what you are doing and what others have tried to do or pronounce themselves as trying to do, is that this initiative has infrastructure or has a framework with which we can all move forward and make this dream become a reality. As you said, I've been more than the last 40 years or so, been part of all manner of initiatives, press freedom initiatives, media development initiatives, and so on around this continent. And we need something like this very urgently at so many levels for so many purposes and so on. So I won't belabor the point that what you have put together, I think, is the foundation for responding concretely to the question of the need for a public interest media system, especially within this digital environment that we live in and confront today. So thank you very much for involving me in this. And any role that Professor Patterson, that you think I can collaborate in. I'm an academic. I was a journalist many, many years ago. I've been a press freedom, media development advocate for these 40 years and so on. So anything that you think I can be associated with for this whole project to move forward, I am very much obliged, and it will be very welcome. Thank you very much, George.
Oh, thank
Thank you,
you.
Prof. Thank you very much. Tom, I'll just quickly try and wrap and then pass back on to you this to round up. But thanks a lot, Prof. One of the things which you mentioned, which I'd like to expand on before I invite Tom Rack, is this. In 1963, it was Ghana and Ethiopia that drove the Organization of African Unity into being. And Edward and I had the privilege of sitting around the table with His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn. And I'm very excited about the prospects that this whole process entails, with specificity to the power, the intellectual power, the infrastructure of enlightenment that this will turn into. Such a great relief to have had the opportunity to talk to His Excellency Haile Mariam, Edward and I, just the ideas in terms of how media's role has to be central to Africa's development. And in that context, the Association of International Broadcasting has been a mentoring organization. I can't thank them enough in terms of pooling resources over the years since 2000, right through to now, to make this dream a reality. So Tom, your comments would be very welcome.
George, thank you very much indeed. And hello to all the distinguished guests on this call. For those who are not aware of the Association for International Broadcasting, let me start off with a very quick summation of who we are. We are a trade association set up to support international broadcasters and publishers who broadcast content across international boundaries. We were formed in '93. Then predominantly the only existing services were the international radio services of people like BBC World Service, Deutsche Welle, Voice of America, and they were our founding members. But of course, technology has well changed that, and we now have members all over the globe. We have been working with George for many years now, supporting his initiative. It's very clear from discussions with our members in Africa and those who are involved from outside Africa, working with Africa, that this initiative, the case for it has been proven, in my view, quite simply. Everybody says it should happen. And I would encourage this meeting to think about moving rapidly, as several speakers have just said, to doing something practical about this. We are now fortunately at the point with technology where market entry for doing broadcasting like this is relatively low. And the key issue, of course, is funds. But with all the people around this call today, the funds for the starting of this project, I think, should be quite easy to achieve. It's the time to move to practicalities. This has been needed for a very, very long time. I think George and I first met when I was a journalist at the BBC many, many moons ago. And even then, the need for this was quite self-evident. So thank you for inviting me to be here today. As an association, we would be very happy to support this in any way we can. And I just hope we can get it going. Time is right for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I wish I could acknowledge everyone on the call, because every single person on this call, including our distinguished leaders, is passionate about getting Africa up and running. We have what it takes. We have access to every facet of industry represented here, including overtures to secure the commitments of technology companies, including overtures to secure the commitments of personalities like Oprah Winfrey to do advocacy. But I'd like to acknowledge one market and two individuals, Benjamin Pius and Dr. Bambushi from the broadcast organizations of Nigeria. It's our biggest market on the continent. Every 5 African people on the planet. One is Nigerian, of every 5. So Dr. Bambushi, do you have a view to share with us in terms of how the collateral of the Nigerian market can be applied to the prospects of fundraising? Because every investor wants to see a return on investment, and everyone looks at Nigeria, including MTN, which has had its most successful run on the continent via the Nigerian markets.
Thank you so much. Let me start by appreciating His Excellency, the former President of Ghana. I'm highly elated, and the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Let me say frankly that this program has come at the right time. And I think I can use Nigeria as an example that there is need for this public interest media in entire Africa to tell our stories, to let people know, the whole world know that Africa is not just a dumb ground or a failure continent, but a continent that can actually play its own role in the community of nations, or continents all over the world. Coming to your question, yes, I can assure you that there is a market in Nigeria. BBC Africa Media Initiative will tell you that Nigeria has been a very fertile land, and I can assure you that this project is going to succeed very highly. A number of media organizations, both privately owned and publicly owned, they're here in Nigeria, and I equally believe that there has been a lot of support from the private sector in Nigeria too. So I can assure you that by the grace of God, with this kind of initiative that we have been waiting for, because there's need to liberate Africa by Africans through the media. And the media is there to do it. So the market is there, it's not going to fail. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got 3 more minutes. I'll hand over to Tom, but before I do, I'd like to acknowledge as well the presence of Dr. Yeboah Benin from the School of Communications, University of Ghana, Dr. Abdulaziz Dido from the School of Communications at the University of Addis Ababa, my friend Michael Makunen, without whom we would not have had access to His Excellency Haile Mariam, former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. I'd like to thank Benjamin Pius, who will be taking this meeting onwards across Africa from Monday. I also want to acknowledge Muriel Lamin, who I know will add significant value. She's passionate about a Pan-African network and Africa knowing itself. And she's at the BBC and will bring up confident a lot of resource to bear, both on the commercial and the public sector. I also like to acknowledge Julieta Santi, who's an MP and MPP from the Kennedy School of Government, who's also the CEO of the National Film Authority and is extraordinarily passionate about change in Africa. So with that, I'd like to hand over back to you, Tom, for this very inspiring meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, George. You know, I think we're seeing, as Professor Karikari mentioned, I think we're seeing the genius of George for envisioning and starting to assemble the infrastructure that's going to be needed to move this forward. I think the challenge now is to be able to put some flesh, some meat on that infrastructure. And I think fundamentally that's a question of funding and to be thinking hard about how we fund these initiatives to move forward. Harvard has not been very bashful, has never been bashful about asking for money, but I do think that's kind of a paramount need at this point, is to begin to fund these extraordinary ideas and the network and systems that have been put in place. I think that is the high priority right at the moment. I think the ideas are there, the will is there, the commitment is there, and now to move it forward, I think we need to be thinking hard about funding. So if you have ideas on that score, please drop a note to either George or myself. We'll assemble them and begin to act on them. And in closing, a special thanks to the President and Prime Minister for joining us and sharing their thoughts and their leadership with us. It makes a difference that you're on board with us on this thing. And thanks to all the others who are here and have joined us and have spoken. And a special thanks to my friend George, who has been such an inspiration for us at the Shorenstein Center and for all of you. It's his ideas that are propelling this, and I think we all owe George a big thanks. So thank you for your time. And again, thank you for joining us. I don't think this is the last of these conversations, and I hope you'll be with us the next time. So thank you very much. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.